Emmanuel Manny Perez, goodbye. We never even knew you. Perhaps the only surprising thing about this Celtic exit was that he moved to America, and it wasn't to New York Red Bulls. It was instead to Portland Timbers, where Perez will get to follow in the brilliant footsteps of Chris Boyd.
On the soccer field, I'm lucky enough to get the occasional thing for free, like a free kick, for example. When it comes to scoring quality mattresses for as close as free as I'm going to get...
Mattresses, Chris. Any excuse to play that old clip. Right, moving on, and Perez played the same amount of Celtic games as Andrew Gutman. That was 0, by the way. Cameron Harper managed 1 more, while the other player that's left to go to the MLS lately, Patrick Klimala, did play a little bit more, but probably made about the same impact. There are the same fears over Luca Connell, Jonathan Afolabi and Leo Connor, who are yet to make a Celtic appearance between the three of them, in a competitive game at least, while in the last couple of years we've had Vakun Bayo, Marian Shved and Abu Kouassi all signed for decent fees and not making any sort of impact at the club. This season, of course, Vasilis Barkas and Albion Ajeti as well. With all those players signed for the club and making little impact, certainly in the first year after being signed, I can't be the only one kind of questioning what's the point. Now, to be fair, I'm an absolute stickler for a new signing. I love new signings and I love envisaging what the future could hold for them. Genuinely, last week, it occurred to me that one of the players I'd marked out for huge things at the club about a decade ago never made it at Celtic. I hadn't quite come to terms with the fact that Holmbert Frid Johnson had never made his Celtic breakthrough. Looked him up before this video. He's now 28. He's playing for Brescia in Serie B. So Celtic have had a fair few players, let's just say, that haven't quite made it over the years. But maybe I'm just misremembering history, but it does seem to be much worse nowadays with regards to our hit rate for signings. In the club's defence, they will probably point out, if they had a right to respond to this video, that they still generally seem to make a profit with regards to signing and selling players. They only really need one Jeremy Frimpong, sold for 10 million odd to Bayer Leverkusen earlier this year, to make up for 5 or 6 dud signings. Equally, the likes of Ismail Assoro and David Turnbull could well be sold on for similar money, in Turnbull's case possibly double that in years to come. So the club would still argue that they're the head of the game with regards to making signings and turning a profit. But it does just seem, from a fan's point of view, like we waste a hell of a lot of money on players who come in and never make any sort of impact before leaving. This season we made 7 signings, 3 permanent signings, 4 loan signings. Of those 7, only 2 of them have made any sort of notable impact. David Turnbull and Mohamed El Yunusi. And you could argue that both of those were safe bets, safe signings. David Turnbull, because he was coming from Scotland, literally 20-25 minutes away to Celtic Park. He knew the league. He was never really going to struggle to settle into his new surroundings. He probably didn't even have to move house to come to Celtic. Mohamed El Yunusi, who was a loan signing, I'll touch more on them later on, but he was a pretty safe bet because he'd already spent a season at the club last year. We knew what we were getting with him. He knew what he was getting from Celtic. He knew his teammates. He knew Neil Lennon, the manager. He knew the club hierarchy, I'm sure. That was a pretty safe bet. Looking at the other ones, Vasilis Barkas is the one that puzzles me a little bit. Everything pointed towards Barkas being quite a good Celtic goalkeeper. He was the right age coming into his peak years. He wasn't young, but he still had a hunger to get better and to move on in the game. He was coming from a team in Greece who were used to winning matches. He'd won the league title there. He played in the Champions League for them. He was a Greek international. He'd even had experience of playing at Celtic Park. It ticked all the boxes you would want from a goalkeeper, and I'm pretty surprised that it hasn't worked out for Barkas this season at least. He's obviously had his confidence shot by, well, Neil Lennon basically. Let's not beat around the bush. Hopefully Barkas can resurrect his Celtic career next season, but I must admit things aren't looking particularly good when John Kennedy hasn't managed to get him into the team in his months in charge either. Albion Ajeti had a good scoring record in his homeland Switzerland, but was it really wise for Celtic to pay £5 million for a guy who had virtually had a gap year last season at West Ham. In hindsight, would it have been better, more wise to sign him on a loan deal, and then we would have had the option at this point to either renew it or to just cut ties with Ajeti? That theme of signing players who aren't getting game time at their current club and just hoping they would come into Celtic and make a difference hasn't worked out for us this season and in recent years. It's been mainly typified by the loan signings we've made, 3 in particular this season. You know them: Shane Duffy, Diego Laxalt and John Joe Kenny. If you were to canvass opinions of the Celtic support, you would probably have these 3 near the top of the list of our poorest players this season, and they've got a fair bit of competition. I think all 3 of them share similar flaws with regards to their Celtic career. They look well off it. They don't look sharp. They look like players who haven't played much in recent years. They seem to lack an intensity to play for Celtic. And as things have deteriorated this season, these players have got worse and worse, possibly because they don't have that real tie to the club that a permanent Celtic player would have. For me, loan signings shouldn't be players like those 3 who are brought in as a must to cover a position. Ideally, loan signings should be players who can come in and add a bit of stardust to the Celtic first team. So in recent years, obvious examples: Patrick Roberts, Odsonne Edouard originally, and Mohamed Elyounoussi. In fact, if you actually look at the loan signings we've made over the last 4 or 5 seasons, defensive-wise, probably Fraser Forster is the only one you could look at as being a huge success. And like Elyounoussi, he already had experience of being at Celtic a few years earlier. It wasn't as much of a risk. So going forward, I would prefer Celtic to look at loan signings as an opportunity to add a bit of stardust, a bit of quality that we couldn't afford to sign permanently, rather than relying on loan players to fill gaps. It's quite telling that when Shane Duffy, John Joe Kenny and Diego Laxalt all signed, they were straight into the first team from the first day. Now, they've basically all come out of the first team since, but they were signed because of poor squad planning. We needed positions filled, and this is something the Celtic management and the Celtic directors and the Celtic recruitment team have to work on for the future. I think the French market has proven to be quite a valuable place for us to shop in recent years. I think it represents better value for money than England. I think that much is clear. The English market is inflated, and to be honest, France is producing far more and far better players than England at the moment. You only have to look at the quality and the amount of options available in not just the French senior team but the under-21 team to notice how many top players France are producing. So I'd like to see Celtic continue to look in that market. If Eddie Howe, as expected, does come in to be Celtic's manager next season, I think it's pretty obvious that we'll see a lot of signings from down south, and we'll see a lot of signings of players that Howe has worked with in the past. That'll be quite similar to Brendan Rodgers' first season at the club, when he brought in Kolo Toure and Scott Sinclair, 2 trusted players that he'd worked with in the past, and also Moussa Dembele, a player that he was well aware of from his time down south. Needless to say, those 3 worked really well, and they raised the standard of the Celtic first team in the Invincible season. The biggest problem I've got for next season, this summer, is that there is far more upheaval expected at Celtic than there was in 2016. Looking back to that summer of 2016, the players we actually lost of note: Charlie Mulgrew, Stefan Johansson, Chris Commons, 3 decent players for Celtic, but if you're comparing them to, say, the impact of Odsonne Edouard, of Scott Brown and of Christopher Ajer, 3 players who we could potentially lose this summer, 2 of them almost guaranteed, then it is night and day. The problems really are everywhere you look in this Celtic squad. Goalkeeper, massive issue. Fullbacks, well, when we lose those 2 loan players, we're going to have massive issues there as well. Centre-backs, Julian injured, Duffy leaving, Ajer possibly leaving. You could just be left with Stephen Welsh for the start of next season. Midfield, centre mids, you're starting life without Scott Brown, perhaps the most influential Celtic player in, I don't know, the last 15 years, possibly longer at the club. The wings are an issue as well. And of course, up front, we're just in complete tatters. If Odsonne-Edouard leaves, who knows what's happening with Lee Griffiths. Klimala's already away. Bio is out of the picture, and Ajeti is far from convincing. There is a huge, huge task ahead at the club. I do think it all comes from getting the right people in the right roles prior to recruitment, though. I think getting a manager in who has a game plan, knows the way they want to play, and can sign players and coach players to play that way. This season, it's just looked like we've not had a clue with anything. I don't think Neil Lennon really ever knew his best Celtic team, his best Celtic formation, his best Celtic way of playing, the way he wanted his team to play. I don't think John Kennedy really has much of a clue either. Just a couple of examples of that earlier this season. Fans wanted Shane Duffy signed. I'll admit I was a big fan of signing Shane Duffy, but he clearly wasn't scouted properly, because if you'd have taken a look at Shane Duffy, you would have seen that he's not comfortable with the ball at his feet. So why then sign him for a team that has the guts of 60% possession in every domestic game? Albion Ajeti was so clearly a striker who plays best with a partner. So why sign him for a 3-5-2 originally and then change formation so that when he does play, he's playing up top on his own? You could say the same about Diego Laxalt. He was signed as a wing back. A few weeks later, he's currently playing left back. John Joe Kenny, a player who, without trying to be harsh, is pretty limited going forward. He's quite a defensive fullback. Why is he getting signed for a team that relies so much on their wing backs to provide an attacking threat? Those are just examples of Celtic clearly not doing their due diligence on signings this season, and I just really hope we can get it right next year. If we can get the right people into the right roles and come up with an idea, a plan for how we go forward as a team and as a club, I do think this is salvageable.